And when things are normal in the economy, it's fairly easy to predict what demand will be for the next quarter. But when things are distorted with constant disruptions, we can see people over ordering, under ordering. It's really hard for them to know, given how distorted the patterns of consumption were during COVID. It's hard for them to predict what consumption will be post-COVID, particularly if demand is slowing. So what that means is that there's a risk, because supply chains have been so distorted for so long, that we may be overproducing into a world of slowing demand. And that could be a material risk for an inventory-led recession.